In the winter of 1847, workers at the Millbrook Falls Textile Company uncovered something that would haunt their town for generations. Beneath the loose boards of the main warehouse floor lay bundles of old papers, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and family records that exposed a disturbing truth about the Weatherby family, the industrial dynasty that built and controlled Millbrook Falls. For 3 generations, the Weatherbys had deliberately married cousins, binding their wealth and power ever tighter. At the center of it all was Silas Weatherby, a man who took 3 of his first cousins as wives in succession, raising children whose lives were hidden from public view. What the workers found was so unsettling that doctors, clergy, and officials had colluded to keep it buried for over 40 years. The revelations would eventually lead investigators to the shuttered 3rd floor of the Weatherby mansion, where even darker secrets waited. In the 1850s, Millbrook Falls was a monument to American industrial ambition. In just 2 decades, it had transformed from a small farming village into a booming textile hub with more than 2,000 residents, all drawn by the mills along the Millbrook River. The Weatherby Company dominated the valley, its red brick factories lining the water for nearly half a mile. Day and night, the thunder of the looms filled the air, a mechanical heartbeat that defined the lives of everyone in town. At the helm was Silas Weatherby, a man both respected and feared. By 1854, at 43, he had the sharp features and cold eyes of someone carved out of winter itself. Workers watched for the smallest twitch of his jaw or the drumming of his fingers, knowing those signs meant judgment was coming. His granite mansion stood above the mills like a fortress, its polished windows projecting wealth and stability, though the permanently shuttered 3rd floor whispered otherwise. Servants hurried through their work with nervous precision, refusing to answer questions about what went on upstairs. Religion in Millbrook Falls centered on the grand white spire of the First Congregational Church, generously funded by the Weatherbys. Reverend Josiah Holbrook preached endlessly about family duty, divine favor in business, and the importance of keeping bloodlines pure. His sermons echoing the philosophy that had guided the Weatherby marriages for decades. The town's social order mirrored its mills with perfect clarity. At the top sat the Weatherbys, insulated from the world in their granite estate. Beneath them were the supervisors and shop owners who benefited from company favor, the Hutchinsons at the company store, the Brewsters running the largest boarding house. And beneath all of them labored the mill workers crammed into company tenements by the river. These men and women were Irish immigrants fleeing famine, French Canadians leaving the lumber camps, and displaced New England farmers chasing wages. They worked 12-hour days surrounded by choking dust, spinning belts, and fire hazards. Yet many believed Millbrook offered more stability than anywhere else. The company paid on time, the housing was at least serviceable, and a company doctor treated injuries without charge. Silas Weatherby himself sometimes walked the floors, his glacial eyes sweeping the rows of looms, remembering names and faces with a precision that unsettled even as it impressed. Silas Weatherby's attention to detail reached far beyond the mills. Workers often whispered that he seemed less interested in productivity than in the personal lives of those he employed. He asked pointed questions about wives, children, and extended families, questions that felt less like casual conversation and more like a careful accounting. The Weatherby influence was everywhere in Millbrook Falls. They funded the school, stocked the library, and even donated the land for the cemetery. When the railroad came through in 1852, it was Weatherby money that ensured the depot stood exactly where it would most benefit textile shipping. The town's only newspaper, the Millbrook Chronicle, relied heavily on Weatherby advertising, and its editor had become a master at framing even grim developments in the industry as signs of progress. But it was within the web of family ties that the Weatherby grip on the town was strongest. Silas's uncle Ezra controlled company finances. His cousin Jeremiah ran mill operations, another uncle Caleb practiced as the town's physician, and cousin Rebecca was married to the local magistrate. Every important decision in Millbrook Falls, from business to justice to medicine, passed through the hands of someone bound to the dynasty by blood. By 1854, the town had grown used to this system. The mills brought steady work. The Weatherbys offered leadership, and Reverend Holbrook's sermons supplied divine validation. Life moved to the rhythm of the looms, and few questioned why Silas, now in his mid-40s and already a towering figure in the town's success, had never taken a wife. Most assumed that a man of such stature was simply too occupied with business to settle down, or perhaps had yet to find a woman worthy of his position. The truth was far stranger. That autumn, whispers turned to shock when Reverend Holbrook announced from the pulpit the upcoming marriage of Silas Weatherby to Miss Patient Weatherby, daughter of his uncle Ezra. The words fell across the congregation with the weight of a funeral toll. Patient sat quietly in the family pew, hands, folded eyes fixed on the altar. She was 24, pale and delicate, her beauty untouched by sun or hardship, her expression unreadable. Dressed in dark blue wool, with glinting jet buttons, she looked the picture of composure, though her eyes betrayed something closer to sorrow than joy. As soon as the service ended, the town buzzed with disbelief. Neighbors leaned together in hushed tones, shaking their heads. "But they're first cousins," Mrs. Elena Hutchinson murmured to her husband as they passed the crowded mill tenements. "Surely that cannot be proper, even if it isn't against the law." William Hutchinson, who supervised the carding machines and knew better than most how the Weatherbys ran their affairs, placed a firm hand on his wife's arm. "That's not our concern, Elena," he warned quietly. "Mr. Weatherby knows his own mind, and Reverend Holbrook wouldn't have spoken from the pulpit if the matter were improper." But the gossip spread quickly, drifting from the company store to the boarding houses, and most dangerously among the mill workers during their short meal breaks. The French Canadians raised under Catholic teachings about blood ties were particularly disturbed. In Quebec, such a union would demand special dispensation from the bishop, muttered Philippe Bouchard, who ran one of the great looms in Mill No. 2. Even then, he added, it would be discouraged. The Irish, hardened by desperation and long accustomed to compromise, voiced more practical fears. "It's the children you need to worry about," Bridget Ollie remarked as she adjusted the shuttle on her frame. "My grandmother always said when cousins marry, the children suffer. Weak minds, twisted bodies, the sins of the parents falling on the young." Those conversations might have remained idle talk, if not for the arrival of Dr. Marcus Penfield. Fresh from Boston and barely 30, Penfield had trained at Harvard Medical School and come to Millbrook Falls to establish a practice free from Weatherby control. When he heard of Silas's intended marriage, he felt duty-bound to speak. Their meeting took place in Silas's office on the second floor of the main mill, a severe room dominated by an oak desk and ledgers that seemed to account for every thread, wage, and life in town. Penfield carefully laid out his case: medical risk, moral concern, social unrest. But Silas listened with the patience of a man confident he had already won the argument. Dr. Penfield, Silas said evenly, "I value your concern, but you are misinformed. My uncle Caleb has practiced medicine here for over 2 decades, and his conclusions differ from yours." The younger physician pressed on, citing medical literature on the dangers of consanguinity. But Silas's interruption was smooth and cold. "You assume weaknesses that do not exist in my family. We have kept meticulous records. For generations, the Weatherby line has been strong and untainted." The weight of his words left Penfield unsettled. What records could Silas mean, and what kind of man kept them? Before he could ask, Silas leaned forward, his pale eyes fixed on him with chilling certainty. "Reverend Holbrook has studied the matter as well. Scripture is clear. Abraham married his half-sister, Isaac married his cousin Rebecca. Jacob wed cousins too and was blessed by God. If it was good enough for the patriarchs, it is good enough for us. Penfield, silenced on theological grounds, made one last attempt. Even if religion and medicine permit it, what of the workers? They are already talking. For the first time, Silas's expression hardened, the faintest tightening at the corner of his jaw. Doctor, I advise you to tend to your patients and leave social matters to those of us who understand what this town requires. The conversation ended there, but Penfield left with the unsettling impression that Silas Weatherby was not simply defending a choice of marriage. He was defending a legacy. Silas Weatherby dismissed the concerns with icy finality. The opinions of workers, he said, were of no consequence to anyone's well-being, least of all their own. They would do better to focus on their duties than speculate about matters beyond them. With that, Dr. Penfield left the mill office unsettled, his footsteps carrying him back through the town center. Clusters of workers stood outside the company's store, their conversations faltering into whispers at his approach. The engagement had become the subject on every lip, dividing Millbrook Falls between those who accepted the Weatherby family's authority without question and those who found the marriage deeply troubling. That evening, Penfield resolved to act in the only way available to him. He began a private journal recording every observation he made about Silas and his family. His first entry, dated October 15, 1854, recounted their conversation in the mill office and raised a suspicion that the planned marriage was not an isolated decision, but part of a deliberate pattern stretching back generations. 3 weeks later, on a cold November morning, as the first snow dusted the hills, Silas and Patient Weatherby were wed. The ceremony took place at the First Congregational Church, with Reverend Holbrook presiding, every pew filled with Weatherby kin. Patient wore her mother's altered wedding dress and carried chrysanthemums saved from the last blooms of autumn. What struck observers most was not the grandeur, but the tone, solemn, subdued, more like a funeral than a wedding. In a town where weddings usually meant music, feasting, and dancing well into the night, the Weatherby union was marked by restraint. The reception at the mansion was small, reserved only for immediate relatives and a few select town leaders. Mill workers, given the afternoon off, lingered in boarding houses and taverns, whispering about what the strange marriage meant for the future of their town. Dr. Penfield, watching from a distance, noted in his journal that the bride looked pale and withdrawn, speaking her vows in such a faint voice that many could not hear her. Silas, by contrast, carried himself with the ease of a man sealing a profitable bargain rather than a husband entering matrimony. Even the extended Weatherby family, though dutiful in their participation, seemed tense, as if the union, while expected, brought unease even to them. The couple departed swiftly for a short trip to Portland, leaving behind a community still rattled by what they had seen. That night in Mrs. Brewster's boarding house, as workers gathered around a pot-bellied stove, old Timothy Flanagan voiced the thought weighing heavily on many. "Men like Silas Weatherby don't marry for love," he warned. "There's a reason behind it, and it isn't natural. This marriage will bring things to light we're not ready to see." His words would prove prophetic. The first year of their marriage passed with a surface normality that quieted some doubts. The mills thrived, the town prospered, and Patient Weatherby entered society with grace, hosting teas for supervisors' wives and supporting church charities. Yet to the watchful eye, something was wrong. Patient, always slender, grew visibly thinner. Her complexion turned nearly translucent, her movements slow and deliberate, as though every step demanded effort. On her weekly errands through town, she carried herself with the rigid poise of someone determined not to falter. Dr. Penfield, increasingly troubled, tried gently to ask after her health when they crossed paths outside the post office. She gave a polite but evasive reply, insisting she was well, and reminding him that her Uncle Caleb had long tended to the family's needs. Her gray eyes, however, refused to meet his own, and her words left the impression of a woman reciting a script rather than speaking freely. The way Patient Weatherby stressed the word Constitution lingered in Dr. Penfield's mind long after she hurried back toward the granite mansion on the hill. That night in his journal, he recorded his impression Mrs. Weatherby shows signs of nervous exhaustion or perhaps a digestive disorder. But her unwillingness to speak of her health suggests that such matters are considered strictly private within the family. With autumn came fresh distraction. A fire swept through Mill Number 3, damaging machinery and forcing nearly 200 workers into temporary layoffs. The loss struck Millbrook Falls like a hammer, throwing households into sudden hardship. Silas Weatherby responded with characteristic precision, reorganizing schedules and reassigning men to other mills until repairs could be completed. The crisis underscored what every family already knew: the town's survival rose and fell with the Weatherby empire. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Dr. Penfield received an unexpected visitor. One evening, Mrs. Martha Brewster, who had run the town's largest boarding house for more than a decade, appeared in his office. Normally brisk and self-assured, she now seemed hesitant. Her voice lowered as she settled into a chair across from his desk. "Doctor, I need your word. This won't leave this room." Penfield promised discretion, and she pressed on, clearly uneasy. "It's about the Weatherbys," she said, "and I wouldn't speak of them at all if I weren't worried for people's safety." She explained that in 15 years, she had housed hundreds of workers, honest men, troublemakers, drunkards, and saints. But something strange had begun happening. 3 times in the last 6 months, good, steady men had suddenly left town without warning. On its own, that wasn't unusual. Mill work was grueling, and men often drifted on. But in each case, the departure followed closely after the man had raised questions about the Weatherby family. Old Pete Kowalski had wondered aloud why Silas married his cousin when there were plenty of eligible women in town. Jimmy Sullivan had made a crude joke about the Weatherby family tree lacking branches. And Tom Mitchell, a loyal worker planning to bring his wife and children from Boston, had innocently asked why the Weatherbys kept their children out of the town school. Within days, each man was summoned to the mill offices. Jeremiah Weatherby himself informed Mitchell that his position had been eliminated due to new machinery. That same night, the men vanished. None returned to collect their belongings, tools, clothing, even cherished books, items no working man would leave behind willingly. Mrs. Brewster's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's as though they were in too much of a hurry to pack." Dr. Penfield listened carefully, noting every detail. After she left, he stood at his window, staring up at the Weatherby mansion. The first and second floors glowed with lamplight, but the third remained, as always, dark, shuttered, silent. What was hidden there? The next morning, Millbrook Falls awoke to unsettling news. Patience Weatherby had suffered what Dr. Caleb Weatherby called a nervous collapse. She had been confined to her bed under strict medical care, and no details were given. But the fact that she had not been seen in public for weeks only fueled speculation. Whispers turned into fearful glances, and for the first time, the community's unease edged toward dread. More unsettling than Patient Weatherby's decline was the announcement that followed only days later. Silas Weatherby would marry again, this time to his cousin Prudence, the daughter of his Uncle Caleb. The wedding, it was said, would take place as soon as Patient was well enough to offer her blessing. Something Caleb assured the community would happen within weeks. The news fell on Millbrook Falls like a physical blow. Even those who had swallowed their discomfort over Silas's first cousin marriage recoiled at the idea of a second, especially while his wife still lay pale and bedridden in the mansion on the hill. When Reverend Holbrook addressed the congregation the following Sunday, His sermon only deepened the unease. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." He intoned, his voice trembling with intensity. "It is not for us to question his plan for the Weatherby family. Brother Silas bears a sacred burden, providing work and stability for us all. And the Lord has blessed him with helpmates who share his blood and his purpose. To criticize such arrangements is to doubt God's providence." From the back pew, Dr. Penfield listened with a tightening jaw. The words sounded less like scripture and more like justification, deliberate rehearsed, meant to shield decisions already made. Each time Holbrook spoke of sacred burdens, his gaze slid towards Silas in the front pew, as though the two men shared an understanding that left the rest of the congregation outside its circle. After the service, Penfield stepped forward, intercepting Silas as he made his way to the waiting carriage. "Mr. Weatherby," he said, "I realize your wife is under your uncle's care, but perhaps a second medical opinion might be of value. I have some experience with nervous disorders." Silas turned, his face perfectly polite, yet cold as stone. "Doctor, my wife's health is a private family matter, and it will be managed within the family as is proper. Surely you understand. A woman in her delicate state requires a physician who has known her since childhood and understands the particular sensitivities of our family line." That phrase, particular sensitivities, echoed in Penfield's mind long after Silas stepped into his carriage and rolled away. That night, the doctor's journal entry was his most troubling yet. "I no longer believe these marriages are merely about wealth or influence. There is something about the Weatherby bloodline itself, something that demands careful management, hidden from the eyes of any physician outside their circle. The question that haunts me is whether patient's illness was a tragic result of her marriage, or whether she was chosen precisely because such symptoms were expected." 2 weeks later, the town awoke to grim news. Patient Weatherby had died quietly in her sleep, attended only by Dr. Caleb and her closest kin. Her funeral, held 3 days later, was small and closed to the public. Silas, cloaked in black, displayed a grief that seemed practiced more than genuine. Barely 36 hours after her burial, he stood again at the altar, this time with Prudence Weatherby at his side. The second cousin marriage, arranged with indecent haste, stunned the town. What had once been whispered gossip now hardened into open suspicion. In taverns, boarding houses, and even at church socials, the people of Millbrook Falls began to speak freely of the Weatherby family, and the possibilities they raised grew darker by the day. If Silas Weatherby could bury one wife and take another cousin to the altar within days, what else might the family be hiding behind its polished facade of church piety and industrial success? The marriage to Prudence Weatherby marked the beginning of what townsfolk later called the dark years in Millbrook Falls. Though at the time the changes were so subtle, they settled over the community like coastal fog. Prudence herself seemed an unlikely figure to inspire fear. At 26, she was older and more vibrant than Patient had been, with auburn hair, bright green eyes, and a restless energy that often spilled into rapid speech and nervous gestures. Yet that very unease suggested pressures invisible to outsiders. Dr. Marcus Penfield, already suspicious of the Weatherby dynasty, sharpened his observations. Over the next 2 years, he filled nearly 50 pages of his journal with accounts that painted a chilling picture of how the family extended its grip far beyond the mills. The first thing he noticed was silence. Questions about the Weatherbys vanished from boarding houses, church socials, and the company store. People had not stopped wondering. If anything, curiosity burned hotter after Silas's second cousin marriage. But they had learned to keep their thoughts private. At the same time, a pattern emerged. Outspoken workers were suddenly reassigned to the most perilous machinery, where a moment's distraction could cost fingers, limbs, or life. Requests for family leave were denied, while more compliant workers found their schedules flexible and their burdens lightened. Housing, too, became a tool of control. Families considered cooperative enjoyed reduced rent, fresh paint and better furniture, while suspected troublemakers endured surprise inspections that revealed violations of rules they had never been told existed. Mrs. Martha Brewster, who had once dared bring her concerns to Penfield, found herself directly threatened when her boarding house license came up for renewal. Samuel Weatherby, the town clerk, yet another cousin, explained with bureaucratic precision that boarding houses must now report on their tenants' behavior, including political talk or disturbing personal conversations. The meaning was plain: keep track of who questioned the Weatherbys or lose everything. Reluctantly, Mrs. Brewster agreed, but she could not smother her conscience. That evening, she appeared in Penfield's office again, her voice heavy with resignation. She could no longer risk speaking openly. She confessed not with a granddaughter to support. Then, pulling a worn leather notebook from her handbag, she pressed it into his hands. Inside were 2 years of her own careful notes. Accounts of strange disappearances, suspicious accidents, and punishments that seemed to fall on anyone bold enough to mention the Weatherbys. Penfield read through the night. The entries revealed a chilling consistency. A woman who wondered aloud why Prudence seemed so nervous at church saw her husband reassigned into hazardous work. He lost 2 fingers in an accident within a week. A man who joked about the family tree lacking branches soon had his teenage son dismissed from the company store on trumped-up theft charges. Again and again, curiosity was met with swift, calculated retribution. But it was the final pages that left Penfield shaken. Mrs. Brewster had documented a disturbing absence. Though both Patient and Prudence had shown signs of pregnancy, no birth announcements were ever made. No Weatherby children were seen in town, not at the company school, not at church, not even in the carriages that carried their mothers. "Where are the children?" she wrote in her final entry. In 2 years with Patient and 8 months with Prudence, surely there should be evidence of new life if these marriages are meant to grow the family. The 3rd floor of the mansion remained shuttered. The servants of the Weatherby mansion had long been bound by silence, each forced to sign agreements that forbade them from speaking of their duties beyond the family walls. Yet rumors persisted. Lights were seen at odd hours in the shuttered 3rd floor, and those who worked closest to the Weatherbys never spoke freely about what they had witnessed. Standing at his window one night, Dr. Penfield saw it for himself. A flicker of movement behind the heavy shutters, a shadow passing across a hidden lamp. It was proof enough the 3rd floor was not empty. The very next morning, grim news spread through Millbrook Falls. Prudence Weatherby had collapsed in the garden while tending roses and was carried inside, placed under the care of Dr. Caleb. His diagnosis was familiar, the same nervous exhaustion that had claimed her predecessor. Before the town could process the news, another announcement came as swift as it was shocking. Silas Weatherby had petitioned the council for permission to wed again. This time his 3rd cousin, Charity Weatherby, the daughter of his late uncle Nathaniel. That Silas would seek another wife while Prudence still lingered unconscious in her sick room shook even those who had long since learned to accept the family's strange marital arrangements. Dr. Penfield recognized what others only whispered. This was no accident of family tradition, but a deliberate pattern marriages made not for affection or convenience, but for something darker, something tied to the blood itself. That night, as he set pen to paper, he resolved to uncover the truth. The 3rd floor of the Weatherby mansion would no longer remain a mystery. His investigation began with quiet surveillance conducted under the guise of evening walks to visit patients. By day, the house ran like clockwork, servants tending gardens, polishing stone, receiving deliveries with the calm rhythm of wealth. But after nightfall, the atmosphere shifted. From the shadows near the carriage house, Penfield watched as three women, always the same, slipped in through a side door and ascended the servants' stair to the third floor. They carried basins, folded linens, and bottles that caught the moonlight like glass instruments of a sick room. And then on nights when the town lay stillest, Penfield heard it. Sounds from behind those shuttered windows. Not the weeping of grown women, but the thin, desperate wails of children, long, drawn-out cries that rose and fell until exhaustion silenced them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mary Catherine O'Brien, a young Irish servant barely 18, approached Penfield after Sunday service. She waited until the crowd had gone, her hands twisting in agitation, her voice urgent and low. "Doctor," she said, "I need to speak with someone about what I've seen in that house, and you're the only one who isn't bound to them." That evening, in the dim safety of his office, she told him what he had dreaded to hear. The third floor, Mary Catherine began, her hands trembling. "It isn't empty. There are 6 rooms up there, and every one of them is occupied." She hesitated, her eyes wide with remembered terror. "Doctor, I've seen things that will haunt me for the rest of my life." Mary Catherine described a corridor lined with heavy doors, each secured with locks that could only be opened from the outside. Behind those doors were children ranging from infants to early teenagers, whose twisted bodies and troubled minds bore the unmistakable scars of generations of intermarriage. "There's a boy, maybe 12, she whispered, her voice breaking. "He can't feed himself. His hands won't obey him, and his speech is nothing more than garbled sounds. There's a girl about 8 who rocks back and forth all day, whimpering like a frightened animal. And the babies, doctor? Some of them don't look human at all. Their heads are too large, their limbs misshapen, their eyes unfocused." Penfield felt the blood drain from his face. His medical training told him what he was seeing. The Weatherby line was collapsing under the weight of its own blood. The family's obsession with cousin marriage was producing exactly the consequences modern medicine had begun to recognize, and instead of facing the truth, they were hiding their broken children on the mansion's 3rd floor. "Who cares for them?" Penfield asked, though he already suspected the answer. Mary Catherine nodded grimly. "The same 3 women, Abernathy, Caldwell, Hutchinson. They've all signed papers swearing silence. I heard Mrs. Abernathy once say she's been caring for Weatherby children for over 20 years. That means this didn't start with Mr. Silas. It's been going on for generations." The implications hit Penfield like a blow. This was no recent madness. Silas's father and grandfather had followed the same practices, marrying within the family to preserve wealth and power while breeding generation after generation of hidden victims. Marrying outside the bloodline would have risked exposing the deformities to the wider world. When asked if she had seen any records, Mary Catherine revealed something worse. Mrs. Abernathy kept a logbook, feeding schedules, medications, notes about incidents when the children became violent. The entries stretched back 15 years. Some children were marked as deceased. Others simply disappeared from the records without explanation. Penfield realized with horror that he was looking not only at evidence of imprisonment, but of quiet, deliberate murder. Those children who became too sick, too deformed, or too difficult to hide were erased from existence with the clinical detachment of servants ticking off chores. And there was more. Every night at 9 o'clock, Silas Weatherby himself walked the 3rd floor corridor, inspecting each child like a farmer examining livestock. He kept his own leather-bound journal locked in a safe where he recorded observations with scientific precision. Dr. Mary Catherine said, trembling, "When he looks at them, there's nothing in his eyes. No pity, no guilt. It's like they're experiments to him." The testimony grew darker still. Both patient and Prudence had known about the children. patient had spent nights sobbing after being forced to visit the third floor. Prudence, as her own pregnancy advanced, became more agitated. On the night she collapsed in the garden, Mary Catherine had overheard her screaming at Silas. She would not let her baby become like the others. She had tried to flee but had fallen before reaching the gate. Dr. Penfield understood now. Silas's wives were not chosen simply for their bloodlines. They were chosen because they could be broken. Their fragility, their obedience, their isolation made them ideal participants in the Weatherby experiment, and when they resisted, they too became expendable. Women in the Weatherby family were chosen for one purpose: to be controlled, frightened into silence, and used as vessels for a bloodline experiment that treated children as specimens rather than sons and daughters. When they became inconvenient, when their emotions broke through obedience, they were discarded like tools worn out from use. Dr. Marcus Penfield now faced a moral crisis that would define the rest of his life. He possessed evidence of crimes that stretched from child imprisonment to systematic abuse and murder. Yet he stood alone against a dynasty that controlled every mill, every pulpit, and every seat of government in Millbrook Falls. To expose the Weatherbys meant persuading authorities beyond the town's borders to take the word of an Irish servant girl and a young physician barely 2 years in Maine against one of New England's most respected industrial families. The odds were grim, but Penfield understood that silence made him complicit. Every passing day risked another child's life, and every month brought the chance that Silas Weatherby would erase the last traces of evidence. Mary Catherine's warning gave urgency to his fears. Mrs. Abernathy had spoken of cleaning house once Silas married again, a phrase that meant only one thing: the children on the third floor were living on borrowed time. The planned union with Charity Weatherby would not simply extend the family's tradition of cousin marriage. It would mark the final stage of a generational project, one designed to prune away every loose end. That night, Penfield wrote what he knew could be his final journal entry. If he failed, the words might be the only record of the Weatherby crimes. If he succeeded, they would serve as corroboration when state authorities came to investigate. Either way, he would act. The plan was simple but perilous. On December 14, 1856, during the pre-wedding reception, Mary Catherine would introduce a mild emetic into the family's punch bowl, creating a wave of illness among the guests. Dr. Caleb, old and inebriated, would be unable to cope with the crisis alone. Silas, desperate to avoid scandal, would have no choice but to allow Penfield to assist. Under cover of treating patients, the doctor would slip to the third floor, carrying with him a portable camera acquired in Portland, one of the new models that etched glass plates into permanent images. There he would document what he saw and gather proof that could not be buried by family influence. The night came, and the plan unfolded with unnerving precision. Mary Catherine moved quietly among the guests, refilling glasses and tending trays. Within an hour, the signs appeared: nausea, dizziness, violent sickness. 8 guests were soon stricken, including Reverend Holbrook and town clerk Samuel Weatherby. Caleb, red-faced and unsteady from drink, could barely lift his own medical bag. The house buzzed with alarm servants running to fetch water and cloths. Silas, forced into practicality, allowed Penfield to take command. The young doctor bent to his work administering treatments, more for show than necessity, ensuring his presence seemed indispensable. And then Mary Catherine slipped to his side, whispering words that made his pulse quicken. One of the children upstairs was in seizure, convulsing behind the locked doors of the third floor. Now, she breathed. It has to be now. Mary Catherine raised her voice just enough for Silas to hear and said that Mrs. Abernathy reported a child upstairs in the throes of a fit, and that with Dr. Caleb indisposed, the doctor should take a look. Silas went, white eyes cutting to the stairs, as if measuring whether he could reach the third floor first, but with 8 prominent witnesses watching, he had no choice. Of course, he said, do whatever is necessary, and Mrs. O'Brien will show you the way. The climb up the servants' stair felt like an ascent into hell. With each step, the house shed its polished manners and filled with the raw sound of suffering children crying in wordless wails, or sobbing with the terrible clarity of those who understood too much and could do nothing. At the top, a narrow corridor ran past 6 doors fitted with heavy exterior locks and peepholes. The air reeked of waste-stale medicine and unwashed bodies. Mrs. Abernathy, gray and steeled by long service, met him without a flicker of surprise. Room 4, doctor. Episodes have worsened. Through the window he saw a boy of perhaps 14 in a full convulsion, limbs thrashing against a stained mattress. Across the hall, a girl of about 10 rocked and tapped her skull against the wall, the scars of older injuries ridging her hairline, her stare empty and bottomless. In room 3, twin infants lay misshapen and fragile heads, enlarged limbs, twisted eyes drifting in opposite directions. Bearing witness became as urgent as treatment. Penfield steadied the seizing boy to keep him from injury, then worked quickly with his concealed camera, capturing plates of the rooms that would survive any denial. In a small records room that Mary Catherine unlocked with a practiced hand, he found something worse than rumor. Behind a cabinet door, Dr. Caleb Weatherby's ledgers stretched back 2 decades, precise and damning. Early entries coolly described children of a first cousin marriage as showing moderate constitutional weakness. Later pages mapped a breeding program in clinical detail, matching uncles, cousins, and nieces to concentrate favored traits while managing defects with notes on which pairings produced severe disability and which yielded offspring considered manageable. The most recent entries revealed the point of Silas's successive cousin marriages. Each wife had been chosen for blood compatibility and for traits that, when crossed with Silas, were likely to produce children disabled enough to justify confinement, but not so impaired as to die before they could be studied. Penfield photographed the ugliest pages and slid the plates and notes into his medical bag. Mary Catherine appeared in the doorway, breath tight. "He is coming up, doctor." Mrs. Abernathy tried to hold him, but he says he needs to check something himself. 2 minutes, maybe less. Penfield saw the trap close. If Silas caught them in the records room, the best outcome was a locked door and a lifetime of silence. He made his choice. He would not hide. He stepped into the corridor as Silas reached the landing, the mill baron's face a mask of rage, straining to stay composed. Dr. Silas said in a voice honed for command, "I believe you have misunderstood the nature of our situation. These children are under specialized care for hereditary conditions and require family physicians who understand their particular needs." Penfield stood his ground, the weight of the camera plates and copied pages in his bag, the cries of the third floor rising and falling like a tide behind him, and answered the man who had ruled Millbrook Falls through fear, blood, and lies. The standoff on the third floor would decide not only Dr. Penfield's fate, but the lives of the imprisoned children, and the future of an entire community, bound beneath Weatherby control. He steadied his voice against the fear tightening his chest. "Mr. Weatherby," he said, "what I've seen here tonight has nothing to do with treatment. This is the systematic abuse and imprisonment of children whose only crime was being born into a family that worships bloodlines over humanity." The words fell like a hammer in the corridor. Silas's composure cracked, then hardened again, his tone shifting to the calm persuasion of a man used to negotiating contracts. "Doctor, you misunderstand. These children receive better care than they ever would in any state asylum. They are clothed, fed, and attended by physicians who know their needs. To expose them would serve no one's interests. Their existence would only invite scandal and misery for the families who depend on this town's prosperity. Sometimes the greater good requires harsh measures. It was the logic of a man who had convinced himself his crimes were mercy, that hiding away twisted offspring was a kindness, and that economic stability outweighed any individual's suffering. Penfield saw then that he was not dealing with reason, but with corruption so complete that it no longer recognized its own cruelty. Mary Catherine's urgent whisper broke through the tense silence. "Doctor, the men are coming. Jeremiah and 2 others. They mean to trap you here." In that instant, Penfield understood the truth. His investigation was no longer a secret. The Weatherbys had closed ranks as they had for decades, and his only hope lay not in survival, but in ensuring the evidence escaped with him or without him. He pressed his medical bag into Mary Catherine's hands, voice low and firm. "Hide this. If I don't return within a day, take it to the state capitol. Go straight to the Attorney General's office. Tell them children are dying while politicians wait. Swear to them it is the truth." When Silas tried one last time, it was not with reason, but with menace. "You are alone in this house," he said coldly, "surrounded by a family that has kept its secrets for 20 years. Your word means nothing against ours. Your future here depends entirely on our goodwill. Think very carefully about how this night should end." Penfield didn't answer. Instead, he pushed past Silas toward the stairwell. Jeremiah and his men closed ranks, but the muffled voices from the reception below reminded them that too many witnesses lingered. To kill the doctor now would invite questions they were not prepared to face. He descended the stairs and walked out of the mansion alive. But he knew he had signed his own death warrant. That night, back in his office, he wrote feverishly. He prepared copies of the photographs and notes, sealed them in envelopes, and arranged for their delivery should he fall. He drafted letters to colleagues in Boston and Portland, describing what he had seen in Millbrook Falls, the genetic wreckage wrought by generations of cousin marriage, the imprisoned children treated like livestock, and the calculated cruelty of a family empire built on blood and silence. He did not know whether those letters would ever be read, but he knew that silence was no longer an option. The end came swiftly. On December 18, 1856, the official record claimed tragedy Dr. Marcus Penfield had slipped on the icy rocks of the Millbrook River while making a house call during a winter storm. His body was pulled from the current, the cause marked as drowning, the manner declared accidental. But Mary Catherine O'Brien knew better. She had seen the men shadowing him that night, heard the muffled struggle near the bridge, and understood that the Weatherbys had silenced the only man who dared challenge their empire. Yet she also knew that his fight was not in vain. The medical bag Penfield entrusted to her remained hidden, and with his death, she became the sole living witness to horrors that demanded justice. 2 weeks after the funeral, Mary Catherine set out for Augusta in the dead of winter, carrying with her the photographs, medical notes, and Penfield's final written testimony. At first, the Attorney General scoffed at the accusations of a young Irish servant against one of Maine's most respected families. But when he saw the glass plate photographs rooms lined with locks, children with twisted limbs and vacant eyes, and when he read the precise records in Dr. Caleb Weatherby's hand, skepticism gave way to grim conviction. On February 14, 1857, state officials descended on the Weatherby mansion with physicians from the Maine State Hospital and representatives of the newly formed Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. What they found eclipsed even Penfield's testimony. The third floor held not 6, but 8 rooms, 2 of them hastily cleared in the weeks following the doctor's death. The remaining children, ranging from infants to near adolescents, bore every mark of hereditary ruin. Misshapen bodies, vacant stares, and minds broken by both genetics and years of confinement. The The air was thick with the stench of neglect and despair. The records confirmed what the rooms revealed. Dr. Caleb's journals, meticulous and clinical, describe 2 decades of calculated unions experiments in bloodlines and the systematic elimination of children deemed unmanageable. At least a dozen deaths long, attributed to illness or misfortune, were exposed as deliberate neglect or worse. Each entry read like a livestock ledger, but the subjects were children, their humanity erased in pursuit of a monstrous vision of purity. The arrests followed quickly. Silas Weatherby, his uncle Caleb, cousin Jeremiah, and 3 household servants were taken into custody. Charity Weatherby, only recently wed and already pregnant, was at first regarded as a possible victim. But testimony from Mary Catherine and other servants shattered that illusion Charity had known, had approved, and had agreed to marry Silas because she believed in the experiment itself. The trial that followed would be remembered for generations as the moment when Millbrook Falls finally saw the truth that had festered behind the red brick walls and shuttered windows of the Weatherby empire. And though justice came too late for the dozens of children whose cries had echoed unseen in the mansion's 3rd floor, the exposure of the Weatherby crimes marked the end of a dynasty built on blood. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Maine's history, drawing reporters from Boston, New York, and beyond. The state's evidence was devastating: Dr. Penfield's glass plate photographs, Mary Catherine O'Brien's testimony, and Dr. Caleb Weatherby's meticulous records, which laid bare decades of calculated cruelty. The defense claimed the family had only been providing the best possible care for children whose disabilities made ordinary life impossible. But the images of locked rooms, neglected bodies, and the cold clinical journals rendered such arguments grotesque. Silas Weatherby was convicted of conspiracy kidnapping and accessory to murder in the deaths documented in his uncle's journal. He was sentenced to life at the Maine State Prison, where he died in 1863, reportedly insisting to the end that his actions had been justified to protect both family and community from scandal. Dr. Caleb, whose own handwriting condemned him, was convicted of multiple counts of murder and abuse. At 74, he became the oldest man ever sentenced to death in Maine, though he died of natural causes before the sentence could be carried out. The Weatherby empire collapsed. The mills were sold to cover legal costs and the children's care. Without its economic engine, Millbrook Falls withered, fading from a booming textile hub to a half-abandoned town. The granite mansion on the hill stood vacant for years before its demolition. But townsfolk whispered that the 3rd floor never fell silent, long after the last children were removed. Cries were said to echo from behind its shuttered windows. Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose bravery had cracked open the Weatherby secrets, was resettled in Boston with help from the state and Dr. Penfield's colleagues. She married Ray's children and lived quietly, never speaking publicly again beyond the testimony that changed history. The surviving Weatherby children were placed in state institutions where they received proper medical care, though most did not live long. A few of the youngest survived into adulthood, one even adopted into a Portland family, his descendants carrying traces of the genetic legacy that later physicians would recognize as the dark fruit of generations of inbreeding. The Weatherby case became a landmark in child protection law and in the early study of heredity. Medical schools across New England used Penfield's notes and Mary Catherine's testimony to teach future doctors the dangers of consanguinity, ensuring that what had been hidden in Millbrook Falls would not be so easily hidden again. But questions linger still. Did the state uncover everything the Weatherbys had concealed? Or did some secrets die with Silas in his cell? Perhaps the full truth was buried in the river that claimed Dr. Penfield, or locked forever in the journals never found. So what do you think? Was the Weatherby case fully revealed, or does the family's darkest legacy still remain in shadow? If this story left you chilled, Share it with someone who loves dark mysteries, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of horror history and secrets too terrible to remain hidden.